afternoon, everyone, and I want to thank you all for coming to my lecture recital today. My name is Lončar, and I'll be presenting an overview of the classical guitar works by the prolific Croatian guitarist, composer, arranger, clinician, and educator, Miroslav Lončar. Lončar has composed over 80 works for the guitar, which include multi-movement solo works, student pieces, and chamber settings that range from duos to octets, concertos, and other multi-instrument ensembles. With this much material, I will only be able to delve deeply into a few of his works, but I will highlight the musical languages that can be found across all pieces and why his music deserves to become a staple in the guitar repertoire, especially those of guitar educators. My lecture will include a brief overview of who Miroslav Lončar is as a musician and his overall output. Then I will discuss and perform 8 pieces that I believe best encapsulate the style of the composer throughout his mediums: 5 student pieces, 2 solo works, and a guitar quintet. So now for a brief background on who Miroslav Lončar is and his accomplishments. He is currently based in Loudoun County, Virginia. He studied at the Academy of Music in Graz, Austria, with Marga Boimel and Martin Misleveček, where he completed his bachelor's and master's degrees in classical guitar performance and met his wife and duo partner, Natasha Lončar. He received his Doctorate of Musical Arts degree from the University of Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and then later became the director and artist in residence at William Carey University, previously called William Carey College, which is also in Hattiesburg. He currently serves as director of the guitar program at Parkview High School in Sterling, Virginia, and is the president of the Aguado Guitar Concert Series, which is a nonprofit organization that was founded in the year 2000. The duty of the organization is to promote the classical guitar in a variety of mediums, including concerts, competitions, master classes, and an after-school guitar orchestra by the name of Loudoun Youth Guitars that he directs. Guitarists who have performed for this series include names such as Ana Vidovic, Petri Ceku, Thomas Villato, Mak Grgic, Matt Palmer, Julian Gray, Nicholas Galusis, and many others. The after-school guitar orchestra consists of many passionate students from the Loudoun County area. This ensemble has had the opportunity to perform in prestigious venues such as the Kennedy Center, the Croatian Embassy, and the National Institute of Health, while also collaborating with world-famous guitarists such as Ana Vidovic and William Keningeiser. He has also been successfully holding the International Summer Guitar School in Karlovac, Croatia, which is his hometown, since the year 2000. Miroslav Lončar's performance career is extensive, having traveled around the world as a collaborative musician in many settings, including concerto invitations, operas, and chamber ensembles. He performs in a longtime duo with his wife, Natasha Lončar, as well as in a family trio that includes his daughter, Maya Lončar. He also performs regularly with Trio Bolero, a trio with his wife and cellist Rebecca Stark, and with one of the most accomplished Austrian pianists, Markus Schirmer. Lončar strives to perform in every style and occasionally participates in jazz, Croatian folk, and rock and pop ensembles. As a composer, Miroslav Lončar has become one of the largest driving forces of modern pedagogical guitar compositions. He studied privately with Dusan Bogdanovic, who provided him with direction and composition. Lončar started performing and teaching during a period of music where the classical guitar was experiencing a gradual boom in higher and public education, but most materials were found from traditional centuries-old sources. Lončar has primarily operated under this idea: if you cannot find the resources you need, then create them yourself. This has led to all of his achievements listed above. If there is no classical guitar society around you, create one. If there is no guitar competition around you, create one. If there is no piece that meets the needs of your students, compose one. Lončar's first composition started in Graz to accommodate the need for a fun and easy repertoire for his younger students. He has published multiple books, which include sets of solo pieces directly aimed at students from lower intermediate to advanced levels. He has also composed and arranged works for his guitar duo, the Klasins and Lončar duo. When he started working in guitar ensemble settings with his director positions, he composed pieces with multiple parts that were relevant to the interests and different levels of his students. While Latin and Spanish styles have always been a staple in guitar repertoire, Lončar began incorporating them more to adapt to his large population of Latinx students. The success of Lončar's compositions brought him great recognition in the classical guitar community and led to inquiries for commissions and dedications. Many of his solo works have been composed with a dedicatee in mind, an attempt to capture not only Lončar's personality, but also the personality of the dedicatee. The genres influencing his pieces range from jazz, Latin and Brazilian, which have vastly different harmonic and rhythmic influences, Mediterranean Balkan, which are harmonies he has grown up with in Croatia, classical and personal styles. The personal style of Miroslav Lončar includes eclecticism, breaking expectations of harmonic arrival, chromatic/dissonant tonality, idiosyncratic chord planing, and perpetual motion pieces with ever-changing arpeggio styles that intertwine rhythms between the right-hand thumb and prevalent upper finger melodies. At the end of your handouts, I have provided a complete list of every work that Miroslav Lončar has composed, including all published and unpublished works. The pieces that I will be focusing on are Jazzy Steps, Everyday Blues, A Farewell Elegy, Jim Beam Bossa, Mediterranean Dance, Fantasy Journey, and the first two movements of Who is Adam. I will begin by analyzing the two concert works, Fantasy Journey and Who is Adam, as they are the most compositionally complex. The techniques and musical languages used will be more easily recognized in the 5 student pieces with this order, as well as demonstrate his pedagogical intent. When breaking down the works by Miroslav Lončar, we can refer back to the list of characteristics that encompass his personal style. One of the biggest components in his compositions is eclecticism. Lončar draws inspiration from a variety of genres and styles that he has learned throughout his musical career and upbringing. He is well-versed in counterpoint and the teachings of classical composers such as Bach, Schumann, Haydn, Debussy, Bartók, Villalobos, and Piazzolla. He has always loved composition and theory, and even taught theory at William Carey University. Many of his harmonies are built off of melodic bass lines, which are directly related to counterpoint. The most prominent recurrence we will see throughout his pieces is a descending chromatic bass line. But there are other variations of this harmonic bass line, including ascending lines, diatonic lines, as well as the occasional skip. While this figuration comes up often, Lončar never builds a similar harmony or arpeggio twice. One might expect the same chord progression with these bass lines, or at least multiple repetitions. But Lončar uses harmonies found from multiple different genres that can be built upon these lines to keep each instance sounding unique. His student pieces all draw from these different sources and offer his students the opportunity to learn genres and harmonies that they would not have much experience from traditional student repertoire. Nonetheless, all these genres are prevalent in guitar repertoire, so it prepares them for all styles of guitar playing they may become interested in. Another tool that he uses to find these interesting harmonies is to break expectation of certain harmonic arrivals set up by either his melodies, harmonies, or rhythms. One of the most common and earliest composers mentioned regarding this style is Joseph Haydn. Lončar's harmonies are primarily tonal, so our ears are led to expect what should come next. Instead, Lončar will use modal borrowing or sudden modulations to throw off these expectations. This characteristic is especially important in his student pieces as they teach how to handle important shifts in harmony. If one were to simply play through the piece without paying proper attention to these harmonies, the piece would sound as if it were being played incorrectly. In A Farewell, there are multiple instances where the mood shifts dramatically and the student needs to approach these shifts with artistic care. The primary pedagogical intent behind his student pieces is to teach them the beginning levels of musical artistry and how to approach serious pieces they may encounter in their future studies. In accordance with the previous two characteristics, his pieces incorporate what I call chromatic/dissonant tonality. When listening to his pieces, the audience will always hear a single tonal center, but many of his harmonic changes are related by chromatic step or even tritone relationships. These are normally very dissonant sounding on their own, but Lončar crafts beautiful harmonies by either utilizing the harmonies of different genres outside of its setting or with unexpected modulations. This displays his mastery of harmonic understanding as he always finds a way to make the music flow in an accessible way, no matter the arguably awkward relationships between the notes. All these characteristics also lead to his use of idiosyncratic chord planing. Now, what do I mean by idiosyncratic chord planing? Well, chordal planing is an impressionist technique where chords are treated as a singular melodic note and move in parallel motion to create full melodies. In Lončar's pieces, the planing is often built up of chord shapes that are held in place by the hand and then move about on the neck of the guitar. They are idiosyncratic in the sense that these shapes would visually and physically make sense to a guitarist and even be simple to play, but may prove awkward if attempted on a different instrument. Villalobos is a prime example of this type of planing, such as the beginning of his Etude 12, as well as many other compositions. So for our guitar friends, we understand what Etude 12 looks like, but I'll give a quick demonstration of idiosyncratic chord planing for those who might not know. So it's just this shape. And as you can see, it just moves around. Finally, another prevalent characteristic of Lonchar's pieces is that of perpetual motion pieces. The pieces resemble Bach with compound melodies that create distinct sections, yet not so distinct beginnings and cadences. The pieces are constantly moving, and Lončar incorporates different arpeggio styles that make every section sound different, even if on paper they may not look that way. The use of stratification in all these arpeggios highlights different voices, whether it be the melody on top, an inner voice shining through, or an intricate bass line. Fantasy Journey is the perfect example for this style, as the piece is 6 pages of continuous 8th and 16th notes. But each section and transition tells their own story, whether it be with simple ascending and descending arpeggios, or sections with complex Alberti basses and rhythmic melodies intertwining on top. An additional aspect to mention is that all of his pieces can be described as character pieces that tell a story within each contained work, whether it be a student piece, concert work, or ensemble piece. Having reviewed the primary characteristics that make Lonchar's music broadly recognizable, we can now see how they are incorporated into the list of pieces I will be focusing on today. Alongside these pieces, I have provided form diagrams in the handouts for visual context. I will start with the 2 movements of Who is Adam, as they are the most recent and cumulative of his compositional techniques. Many of what Lončar uses in these movements can be seen as evolutions of his previous works that have grown and led up to his current style, and therefore making it easier to recognize when going backwards. At this point, I'm going to talk through the 3 categories that Lončar does, and then end with my performance. So Who is Adam? Who is Adam was commissioned by guitarist Adam Kostler, who is now the professor of guitar at Appalachian State University. The piece is styled with Kostler's athletic left hand in mind and is riddled with bar chords that are used for idiosyncratic planing. The piece goes through different movements of Who is Adam, with the first 3 movements all being under the same title, Is This Adam? And the final 4th movement being named, Or Is This Adam? The inspiration for the name not only comes from the commissioner, but from one of Lonchar's earliest duet pieces by the title of Who is Eve, to complete the set. The first movement of Who is Adam is prelude-like, with the harmonic profile sounding like early 20th century impressionist music a la Debussy and Bartók. The harmonies are very quartal and open with a cryptogram that spell out the name A-D-A-M, with the notes A-D-A-E, E being the solfege E, me. The melody set in mind to this motif is This Adam? This motif was also based off of the open strings and is a very common technique used by composers such as Ginastera, which uses a lot of open strings. The intro uses irregular meters, octatonic whole tone collections, natural harmonies, and steady rhythms that develop. Section A has a samba rhythm with quartal/quintal double stops that primarily consist of tritones and whole tone relationships, so very dissonant, not perfect fourths like typical quartal harmonies on the guitar. In fact, the descending figure in measure 14 consists entirely of tritone double stops from whole tone collection 1, which is the whole tone collection beginning on C sharp. Measures 15 through 18 act as a transition that references the harmonics and open strings from the intro. There is quartal planing of single finger bar chords and exchanging duple and triple groupings. These duple and triple groupings are built off harmonies that are directly influenced by the shaping of the guitar as opposed to the actual chord shapes, with open strings acting as ostinato. Section B contains an ascending chromatic bass line with planing harmonies and chord shapes to match. The planing is relative as it changes slightly between each figuration. Different beats are stressed in each measure to give rhythmic variety, even though the same rhythm could have easily worked and be used. Section C is the first real melodic section, and the harmonies rise with an octatonic relationship. The harmonies are once again built from shapes rather than harmonies, but are based on ascending 7th chord shapes. This section references the Is This Adam motif, starting in measure 27 as a variation with the notes A, G, B, E, completing the use of all 6 open strings as inspiration for the motif and the quartal dominance for the piece. Measure 31 brings back a variation of section B. Measures 33 to the end act as a coda. The ascending figuration is made of shapes with expanding intervals, half steps to whole steps, which build up to the note G, followed by a final reiteration of the atom motif. This completes a chordal tetrachord with the notes E, A, D, G. The piece employs many standard practices used by Lončar, such as purposefully avoiding harmonic arrivals and rhythms, a la Haydn, chromatic lines, and counterpoint-influenced harmonies built atop baselines, a la Bach, and impressionist influences such as chordal planing and the use of tone collections, a la Debussy and Bartók. Movement 2 is a jazz ballad, and is contrastingly more tonal than the first movement. The scordatura is important to mark as the tuning of the lowest two strings opens up a new key for the guitar, G, while still maintaining a typical guitar tuning that allows for open bass notes. Normally the bass strings are tuned either from highest pitch to lowest pitch, D, A, E, which means pieces tuned in those tunings are typically in A, because we would have the bass notes with solfege, do, fa, sol. Or the guitar is tuned D, A, D, with the lowest string being tuned down from E to D. Pieces written for that tuning are normally in D, because then we have the bass notes do, so, do. By tuning the fifth string down as well, we can now be in G with the open bass strings having the notes so, do, so. While the piece is more tonal, there are still lots of chordal harmonies because of the jazzy seventh chords throughout the piece. The opening melody contains a descending chromatic line in the middle voice. The beginning sounds introductory until the melodic content comes in measure 5. Looking at the overall structure of the piece, though, leads me to believe that the intro and first theme are simply two related themes in one larger A section. The middle section is clearly improvisatory and resembles a call and response between a jazz band, the planing chords at the beginning of each phrase, and the soloist doing intricate licks. To complete the description of the rest of the movement, measure 24 brings back an elaboration on the introductory material from section A, and then measure 32 does a complete restatement of the entire A section with some slight elaborations and harmonic changes. The piece is very sectional, like all of Lonchar's pieces, but the bigger framework resembles a binary form. Now to move on to Fantasy Journey. Fantasy Journey is heavily inspired by rock music and is based on a medley structure, which can also be seen as a theme and variations form. It is primarily in D minor. The piece came to be when I came across a YouTube video of someone playing a medley of songs from the 2010s. I love the way that all of these completely different songs could create a singular, exciting, and coherent new piece. So I went to my father to ask him if he could write me a piece with the same sort of character, the same sound. The piece highly contrasts Who is Adam with its consonant harmonies, thirds, fifths, sixths, octaves everywhere, an overall more tonal approach. The intro is inspired by power chords and starts off very simple rhythmically and breaks down into predictable rhythmic diminutions. The form of the pieces appear to contain 6 main sections, but within all of these sections are highly contrasting transitional materials that can be interpreted as being their own section. This is all more elaborately sketched out in the form diagram in your handouts. Sections 5 and 6 are different from the beginning of the piece as their melodic content is elaborated upon and contains variations as opposed to the previous material. Theme 6 almost seems to have an embedded binary form at the end. All of Lonchar's pieces are perpetual motion pieces with constant 16th or 8th note figurations with constant rhythmic and phrasing variety between all sections, and Fantasy Journey is a long perpetual motion piece. The ending has the most turbulence with an almost Sturm und Drang seen in the rivalry between the minor and major themes. The piece ends with theme 6, which is very interesting considering it is not the last section. This choice gives the previous turbulence a final resolution. Measure 126 to the end really reminds me of my relationship with my father, as they are also the measures that I believe I remember having the most input on. The ending was originally all in major, but I wanted more minor, so we came up with this exchange between the themes being in these 2 different qualities. There is a lot of pushback between the 2 themes, but it works very well, kind of like how I am with my father. The final exuberant chord in D major really shows that even though there can be arguments between major and minor, it is possible to come to a triumphant conclusion. Now some chamber music. Mediterranean Dance is an ensemble piece that utilizes 2 different types of guitars alongside a regular guitar ensemble. The soprano guitar, which is 1 octave higher, and the contrabass, 1 octave lower. The piece is actually a reworking of a student piece from his Pieces for Guitar collection by the name of Mediterranean Sundance. Fantasy Journey was even reworked into a published piece for guitar quartet. The different sections of the piece take the performer and the listener through different times and areas of the Mediterranean. It opens up with Lonchar's signature descending chromatic line in Guitar 3. And then it goes into this Phrygian section that represents more ancient sounding music from countries like Italy, Greece, Egypt, Turkey, Croatia, and other Balkan countries. The rhythms are all syncopated, but each section has its distinct dance rhythm that represents another genre of the Mediterranean. Section B is in major and is more like how modern Balkan groups sound. It is meant to sound like a mandolin orchestra at times and different from the dissonance of the Phrygian mode beforehand, with many harmonies relating by sixth, which is very typical of Mediterranean singing. Measures 49 through 80 bring back sections A through B, but elaborate on them just a little. Section C is our first contrasting section and is meant to sound more like what would be heard in upscale Mediterranean clubs and restaurants with thinner textures and longer held melodic harmonies. Italian groups were becoming more influenced by Latin harmonies, which consist of 7th chord harmonies. While the previous sections were meant to represent more rural, folk, or popular vibes, Section D is meant to represent Mediterranean composers. This section is avant-garde and represents the academic side of Mediterranean music. Composer influences include Papandopoulou and Brkanovic. This dissonance also works from Mediterranean influence, as a lot of old Balkan music can be quite dissonant. The piece ends with a final reiteration of the B section. The multiple repetitions of section A and B give the piece sort of a rondo form. I will now go into brief descriptions of the 5 student pieces, starting with Jazzy Steps. This piece is meant to teach intermediate students of classical guitar how to feel music, rhythms, and harmonies from jazz that they may not be familiar with. One of the new things a student will be introduced to is the idea of swung eighths, as well as syncopated rhythms in general. Another aspect that needs to be learned is the idea of 2 voices and call and response. We once again see a case of dialogue between a jazz band and a soloist in measures 5 through 12. This piece is a perfect first step into teaching children that even a simple piece can have nuances that cannot simply be played straight through, like a student would. A majority of the cadences from the student pieces are also not what classical students would generally be used to and departs from standard 5-1 cadences. For example, Jazzy Steps ends with an add 9 chord. Everyday Blues brings out more of a need to feel freedom in improvisation. While the improv is all written out, this is for a student to get the sense of what licks feel like. There are triplet rhythms and other figurations that require an exchange between free stroke arpeggios and rest stroke melodies in the right hand. This is another piece that helps break the monotonous solo rep of a typical student. The piece is written in a standard 12-bar blues and teaches them what a blues sounds like. In other words, this teaches structured children how to break structure within a structured setting. This piece also ends with another cadence typical of jazz blues style that students may be unfamiliar with. We leave the jazz and blues world and go into A Farewell, which is a traditional and accessible sounding piece with straightforward 8th note melodies and accompanying bass notes. Even so, this piece has contrasting sections that portray different moods and harmonies. The students will need to know how to approach these different moods. For example, measures 17 through 32 cannot be played with the same emotion as measures 1 through 16. The second page also introduces the idea of unexpected harmonies and sudden modulations, which are not typically seen in student pieces. Measures 33 through 44, as seen on the board, modulates 4 times before returning back to the key of C. This opens students up to creative possibilities and expectations. Once again, we see a classical chromatic bass line, this time ascending, from measures 45 through 47 that needs to be brought out by the student. Jim Bimbosa was written specifically for a student named Jim who was not good at feeling syncopated rhythms, especially Latin or Brazilian rhythms, so Lončar composed this piece to help him overcome that difficulty. The piece is written in the style of a bossa nova and can be used to introduce students to Brazilian rhythm and harmonies. The piece has multiple chromatic movements throughout. It is also on the highly advanced side, as there are gentle intricacies that many musicians are unsuccessful with bringing out with Brazilian music. There is also the appearance of yet another unexpected cadence at the end. Finally, we come to Elegy, which I consider to be the most difficult student piece by Lončar. There are many connected lines and phrasings that require the highest maturity from a musician. The piece is based on Argentinian milonga and is similar to a slow movement of Piazzolla. While it is technically not that difficult, the phrasing is complex and not what students typically would see in pieces at their specific level. There are many unexpected harmonies and modulations throughout with different colors expected from the guitar. Chromatic bass lines are evident throughout again, as well as planing chords and an unexpected cadence that the students must prepare for. I have now covered all of the compositional elements that will be brought out by my performance of these select pieces. I want to thank all of you again for taking the time to come and listen to my lecture recital. I hope I have proven that Miroslav Lončar is a talented composer with a vast repertoire of pieces that need to be brought into standard circulation of performances. His pieces are both intricate and simple, beautiful and dissonant, with influences that have come from a lifetime of performing, studying, and teaching that shine through in every composition. I hope you enjoy my performance of his pieces, as well as the chamber performance with my fellow guitar colleagues and friends, Django Klump, Frederick Urenberg, and Bernardo Marcondes Rodriguez. Originally, Patrick Peralta was going to be joining us as well, but he is unfortunately not here, so that role will be filled by none other than Miroslav Lončar, who is here today. I welcome any questions in regards to my lecture after the performance. concert works. of my quintet to come join me for the final piece, Mediterranean Dance. This is our first rehearsal of the piece. We'll do that afterwards. Fine, questions first. I'd like to open the floor up to questions about my lecture, if there are any. Yes.
I'm trying to specifically direct this question to you, although the temptation is great to direct questions to your father since he is directly here. So directly related to you, through this experience of taking some of the pieces of your father and kind of breaking them apart, analyzing them, seeing what goes into them, what have you discovered through this? Is there any sort of extra realization that you have about this music in general?
Well, some of the realizations that I made was, the biggest one that shocked all of us was the most reoccurring thing that I mentioned before, which was that descending chromatic bass line. So that was one of the things, as I was going through all of the pieces, that was something that I saw pop up in every single piece. So that's like, for example, like a small thing. But going through all the pieces was absolutely kind of an exciting adventure because I know all of these pieces very well. I have known my father's pieces my whole life. That makes sense. And but yeah, there are many things that, like, as I was asking him and delving into it, I actually learned how to play the pieces better. So for example, Fantasy Journey is an old piece of mine, and I actually never realized that it was based off of rock music, and it completely changed the way I decided to play it, especially the opening. It completely changed the way that I went through it, knowing that it was that. And then really knowing what harmonies to bring out. So not only did it help me realize just like the subtleties that are consistent through all of his pieces, they definitely help me play them better, especially the student pieces. As I mentioned before, student pieces, it's really easy to just play note by note and then go through. But then when you go through to try to find what those intricacies are, you can see that there's a lot of gold even in just these one-page pieces, and there's a lot of thought actually put into them. It was actually very nice, yeah. So it definitely opened my eye up more to his pieces, for sure.
Thank you. Are we permitted a question to the composer?
If you would like.
So, Lončar, thank you.
Oh,
fantastic. Yes. So I have to say, so just so you know, I work with my author paper.
Thank you.
My pleasure. So in the Fantasy Journey, I have to tell you that there were moments that I could recognize from what I know of rock literature. In certain portions of the Adam movements, particularly, I think the first movement, I felt like I was hearing something very familiar to my days when I would listen a lot to the progressive rock band called Yes. And the guitarist at the time in that, Steve Howe, were you channeling that music at all in writing that?
Not at all. But it is interesting that, sometimes music can, I think it's like an octopus, and it can just, cling to various things depending where you're coming from yourself. And it's great that people can make associations, and another person might think of something else, or another composer, another group, so that polyvalency of the music is, I think, it's really, really fun. But no, the answer is no. No, yes, in this version.
Yeah.
However, one thing that we did not get to experience is that the third movement, which we did not hear, was influenced by music of Shostakovich, and I think it's very, very clear in the movement, because the subject of the piece, Dr. Kassler, loves Shostakovich, and as I said, the first movement is actually sort of like, it was inspired by his love for Southern rock. So I was trying to kind of like put some of that into that perspective.
So one further question regarding the third of the student pieces, the Farewell, which featured very clearly the Pachelbel canon kind of chord progression in that, if I'm not mistaken. And so is there something that you think of with regard to that chord progression in that piece in terms of a farewell type gesture, like a valediction of something?
Right. And again, the answer is no. When I think of that piece, I do not think of the canon at all. But inevitably, pieces with descending bass lines might, end up sounding and having similar ideas, similar chord progressions. But you know, I'm attracted to that idea of descending bass line. Is it, you know, it's you know, it's so popular in the 17th and 18th century as an express of sorrow or departing or of any sort. So that's why it is there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Everybody knows everything. Oh, go ahead.
I guess after having gone through a bunch of schooling and having studied pieces, especially like in theory class per se, and trying to look for answers, having your father right there, were you able to get some of the answers that you were looking for, or all of the answers you were looking for? And if not, did it make sense? Some of these mysteries that we don't understand as the composer as well may not.
Yes and no. So, yeah, yes and no. So definitely there were some where like being able to ask him, like, so for example, I'm trying to think of just one specific part. It's mainly in the Who Was Adam. Fantasy Journey was definitely the most eye-opening. I didn't really notice all of the things. For example, one of the things that he mentioned, so the second movement is the chordal harmonies. He mentioned that his like main inspiration was the Law and Order theme song. So that's like an example, and that kind of made it interesting, and it brings out the quintal and the jazzy parts. But one thing that was interesting going through is, so I would find these consistent things that are very clear, and like I'm able to prove them that they're there, and I would show it to him, and he was like, oh, I never noticed that before. So actually there was like a whole journey on my own. So in some things I didn't notice things, and he would have to point them out and be like, well, this is what I was thinking, this was the inspiration, this is where this is leading to this. And then there were many moments where I found them. And then sometimes that's just how composition goes. That's one of the reasons why I say that his pieces are so eclectic. So when you are surrounded by so much schooling and music and performing and all of that, you can absorb these things that you never even realize are there. So for example, I think it is without a doubt for some of us that in the first movement that there's some octatonic relationships before. And my father has never known what an octatonic collection was before that, so in his time they were not taught that, but you were surrounded by that music, so he's very well versed and knows Debussy and Bartok and all of that, and he was inspired by that sound, like that quality. So stuff like that, you know, just becomes ingrained in you, and you learn it, and it goes through into your pieces. So that was one of the things that I discovered, is that you can be learning about harmonies and pieces and genres that you don't even realize, and you put it into your music.
Do you think it's advantageous if you're going to use some of these student pieces in a teaching context? Would you sort of delve into some of the theory behind stuff, since it's a little bit not so like standard classical repertoire that everyone's used to? It's like you can use it almost to sort of expand the students' theory knowledge as well. So I just curious of your thoughts on that.
Oh, definitely. So like, for example, a farewell is really good because since it's so tonal, but there's these random things, to put it very broadly, that are thrown in there, you can really use that to show students that, like, you know, not everything is just in C, because it starts out very much in C. But then there are B flats that show up, there's B like D major, A major, all of these accidentals and different styles. So I definitely think that it's a very good way to introduce students to, yes, like opening it up to different theories and harmonies. I keep going back to A Farewell is a good one, but also the jazz pieces are very good. So those are some more beginning / intermediate pieces. Those are very good at just showing like certain shapes. So there are many professors that mention the fact that, to put it shortly, like everyone's like, why does blues fit so well on the guitar? And there's this whole conversation that kind of stems around that. And a lot of these shapes that work on blues, that's kind of is how the harmonies were inspired. So it's really more like, did the guitar inspire blues, or did blues shape chords on the guitar? So there's part of that. So when you go through like these pieces, you can see a lot of similar shapes that you can move around and work with. So then you can use that to absolutely introduce to your students, like, well, you really need to bring this out. You've noticed that this whole time that it's been in this key, do you think this note's, but obviously in a lower context, you're gonna be like, well, do you think this note's kind of weird? Does it sound normal, like what you played before? And you can have them expand upon that. Like, if it's different, what do you think you should do right there? So that it makes a difference as to like, why did that B become a B flat? So yeah, absolutely.
Maya, I'm going to ask you this question, but we might have to ricochet over to Miroslav. So composers who write for guitar, you know, sometimes they're guitarists, and that's great. When you get a piece that suits the instrument, fits the instrument. Sometimes we get pieces written by non-guitar composers who actually take the time to get a guitar or a fingerboard sharp, and it fits. And sometimes we get pieces by composers, and it's a disaster. These pieces all strike me as being extremely well made for guitar. So
Very
I
much
will
so.
ask you, but I might have to go to Miroslav. Are you using the instrument when you compose? Are you thinking away from guitar? Where does the guitar fit in with composition?
I can definitely tell you that the guitar is in his hand when he composes. I've walked by his office many a times with his little guitar in front of the computer screen. But I'm sure it's not just so I know that he does in fact use the guitar to expand upon it. So I like to credit a lot of his originality and ingenuity. He is quite a fantastic improvisation artist. So like when he plays jazz, he's actually very skilled at jazz and improving. So I think a lot of that comes from that. So there's obviously all of the background knowledge that, like for example, like the counterpoint, he very much likes to try to abide by the strict rules of like voice leading and counterpoint making, all that. So there's those sections. But all of the rhythms and interesting harmonies come from his skill in improvisation and then having it become into a coherent thing. And then he can delve upon that a little bit more or disagree with me if he needs to.
I always write with guitar in my hand because I think I want my pieces to be playable. I don't want the guitarists to, struggle or have to put the guitar down or the piece down because they come across a section and say, I'm not doing this. So I'm very aware and I try to avoid any awkwardness. If there's like an awkward shift or awkward fingering, I try to make my way around it so that awkward situations really don't happen, because I think it's important that music be playable on the instrument so that the player can actually focus more on making music and not struggling how to perform something.
It's so refreshing. And I hear from so many composers the guitar is so hard to write for. And I wish we could help them get over that. But the music always strikes me as being extremely well made for the instrument, as well as beautiful.
Do we now know everything about Miroslav Lončar? Good. Well, thank you again all for coming tonight. I want to thank my quintet members, of course, for playing and putting this together. I want to thank Nicholas Galusis and Dr. Frank for being able to advise me on all of this and always being there for me. I want to thank all of you for coming along, and I want to particularly thank Tasia and Rose for coming from North Carolina. They're such cool people. And then, of course, I want to thank my parents and especially my father, who is the inspiration behind everything that I do.
Can I say a word, please?
Okay.
Okay. So I don't consider myself a composer primarily. I consider myself a guitarist. So I'm gonna say no guitarist and no father could be more proud tonight.
Can I get a picture with everybody? I feel like that would be